Okay, today's Q&A is about instant coffee, and the question is if it's okay to make coffee, tea, instant coffee and tea, and hot cocoa on Shabbos. Now, the rule is that you're not allowed to cook on Shabbos, and one of the rules of cooking or bishul on Shabbos is ein bishul acha bishul. That means is once something is fully cooked, then the halacha says it's impossible to cook it again. So that means is that if a person has already cooked the food is fully cooked, then there's no isser of bishul on Shabbos if you cook it again. Now, there are two details that we have to know about that rule of ein bishul acha bishul, and the first is like this: that there's the din sees a difference between something called bishul and afiyah. Bishul refers to cooking in water or frying in oil. That's bishul, as opposed to afiyah, which is baking or broiling with just heat and no liquid involved. So the ein bishul acha bishul, that means you can't do bishul after bishul, and there's no afiyah achar afiyah. If you did baking again would not be asur. But there is bishul after afiyah or afiyah after bishul. Okay, so they're in separate groups, ein bishul acha bishul and ein afiyah achar afiyah, but there is bishul achar afiyah and vice versa. The second thing is that there's a difference between solids and liquids. Once a solid food is considered cooked, think about a piece of chicken, once it's considered cooked, it will never lose that status. But a liquid, think about a pot of water, is only considered cooked as long as it stays somewhat hot or somewhat warm. But once it cools off completely, it's considered that the cooking was undone, and if you'd heat it up again, that is a violation of bishul. So you cooked up a pot of water, and that was considered cooked. Then it cooled down back to room temperature. If you cook it again, that is considered bishul, even though it was cooked once beforehand. The bishul was undone, and now this is considered to be a new bishul. So now let's apply these rules to the situation we're talking about. Like this. When you have instant coffee or tea, what that means is that somebody in the factory boiled up this really big pot of coffee or tea, and then they did something to remove the water and turn it into what we call instant coffee or instant tea. For that matter, so not only was it cooked the original time to make the coffee or the tea, it actually was probably even cooked the second time. It's very possible, not automatically, but very possible it was cooked the second time to get that water out of it. So, ein bishul acha bishul should say is, since I cooked it already once, it's okay to put it into hot water on Shabbos, because ein bishul acha bishul, I can't cook it again. Once it was cooked once, there's no cooking. It wouldn't be also to cook it a second time. But some are machmir for this because they say, think about what happens here. When I put the instant coffee or the instant tea powder into water, what happens? They turn into a liquid. They dissolve into the water and turn into a liquid. So the rule of ein bishul acha bishul, as I mentioned, only applies when if it's a liquid, only applies if it hasn't cooled down. Well, here I have a liquid, that's my new cup of coffee, that was at room temperature a minute ago. Now, when it was in a solid. So most say that, no, it was a solid. The powder is a solid, and then ein bishul acha bishul. There's no isser to do bishul on that powder when we recook it. However, in Minchas Yitzchak, he says it's worthwhile to be machmir for the shita that says that since it becomes a liquid by the end of the process, therefore it would be a problem with bishul. So he says what you should do is you should put the instant coffee or the instant tea into a klisheni, meaning to say is put the coffee or tea into a cup that the water isn't already, rather than putting the powder in first and then pouring the water onto it. Pouring the water onto it is called iruk division. That's more closer to bishul than klisheni, where the water was already in the cup and you add the coffee and tea powder afterwards. Now, all that I've been talking till now, it only applies when the only question at hand is instant coffee or instant tea, just the tea powder or the coffee powder. But there are some companies who add other things to their instant coffee and tea. Like, for example, there's some people who add raw ground coffee, some people call it micro grounds, into the coffee powder. Or they add flavors or sweeteners or other things into the powder so that when you put it into water, you don't just get the instant coffee, the instant tea, you get these other things along with it. Now, in those cases, to decide whether you're allowed to use this instant coffee or tea on Shabbos, you're allowed to put it on Shabbos, you'd have to find out whether those items are cooked. Each one of them, you'd have to know whether those items are cooked in the factory. And this that I'm mentioning is even more of a concern, this last point, for a hot cocoa mix, because the cocoa powder per se is cooked as part of its processing. but there are lots of other ingredients, typically lots of other ingredients put in, and you have to evaluate each one of them to decide if the overall mix is okay to be heated or created on Shabbos.